What would happen if Prince Charming or the past broke his facade and began committing crimes and horrors at high speed as if they were the most commonplace thing ever? Instead, it could be violence, fraud, pedophilia, stealing, cheating, or even treason. Find out why many genuinely despise Prince Andrew by watching this video through to the end. Prince Andrew was born into a palace with gold walls protecting him from harm. The man who was once cultivated to be the monarchy's attractive soldier is now its most disgraceful burden, and at 65, the carefully crafted image surrounding him has crumbled. Without explicitly stating it, he has acknowledged that the world was correct all along. The controversies that have dogged him since he was a young man were not exaggerations or insane detractors. However, the palace disregarded the warnings. Prince Andrew was a little boy who thought that rules were just for other people before he ever shook hands, boarded an aeroplane, or encountered scandal. When the world eventually brings his realities to light at age 65, it becomes evident he didn't turn mean. Raised in the shadow of brutality, he was free to control, provoke, and tease without repercussion. Windsor Castle is the source of one of the first stories that makes everything uneasy. Biographer Ingrid Seward claims that when Andrew was around 5 years old, he ventured into the stable yard where grooms and guards were working in silence. He made fun of the on-duty sentry's rigid stance. He gave the dogs a kick. He struck the horse's legs with sticks. He disobeyed the stable staff orders to stop. After a while, two grooms who were tired of his antics forcefully lifted him and tossed him into a pile of manure, covering him with feces. Yes, humiliation, but also a lesson on consequences and setting limits. However, no one followed through. No one pushed for this influential child to change, but that was just the start. Another time, young Andrew made fun of a footman so badly that the footman retaliated, which was against procedure. He hit Andrew and blacked out his eye. Stunned and bleeding, the prince was sprawled on the floor. His carer was furious. The footman, anticipating punishment, offered to step down. The queen declined. Andrew has earned it, she thought. The footman remained. The youngster learnt something harmful since they could be hit and still be protected. Provocation is your power, and surviving their strikes is your privilege. These initial occurrences weren't isolated mischievous acts. They resembled foreshadowing sketches of Andrew's actions in front of the public. The man who insisted on having stuffed bears organized, curtains drawn perfectly, and personnel frightened by small slip-ups was the same youngster who made fun of guards at 5 o'clock. The toddler whose face was scouted by a footman grew into an adult who was scouted by denials, news releases, and words. Andrew was already developing a very different reputation in the early 1980s when Princess Diana enthralled the world with her beauty and purity. He was supposed to be the charming younger son, the bachelor prince whose love affairs would thrill the masses, and he would be attractive in uniform. Inside the palace gates, he instead had a reputation for being pampered, conceited, and dangerously immature. He was described by household personnel as being cruelly demanding and giving them orders with the entitlement of a man who had a god complex and thought he was superior to everyone else. Former maid Charlotte Briggs described how Andrew once yelled at her for leaving a tiny opening in his drapes, making fun of her for an error that no one else would see. This behavior was regular rather than sporadic. Stuffed animals lined up in precise sequence filled his bedrooms. He became furious like a toddler if servants moved a teddy bear or did not arrange them on his exact map. It appeared odd to outsiders. It was abuse to those who worked with him. A 35-year-old man who acts like a 5-year-old boy when he throws tantrums. He was excused by his mother. He was referred to by his father, Prince Philip, as the spare, a man who would play second to Charles but would not be subject to the duties required by the crown. A darker aspect of Andrew's personality was nourished by that freedom. The general population gave him the name Randy Andy as he matured into manhood. Andrew took great pride in his reputation as a playboy, in contrast to his brothers, who were more circumspect when it came to the media. He displayed his wealth, courted models and actresses, and presented himself as untouchable. The fantasy story came crashing down in 1986 when he married Sarah Ferguson. Scandal ruined their marriage, with Andrew continuing his own careless behavior and Ferguson being exposed in embarrassing situations. Following their divorce, their strange intimacy stoked additional rumors. Andrew was now viewed by the monarchy as an unpredictable liability rather than a trustworthy representative of the crown. The decay got worse throughout the 1990s. Andrew was taking taxpayer-funded trips around the world when Britain was going through recessions and austerity. His lavish use of private jets and helicopters, which cost the taxpayer millions, earned him the moniker Air Miles Andy. His extravagant vacations, his misuse of his military position for benefits, and his spending patterns were all made public by newspapers. The public became more incensed, wondering why this man, who did few important tasks, was squandering money when regular families were struggling. He thought his title protected him, so he brushed the criticism off. Nobody anticipated the extent to which his conceit would ultimately bring him and the monarchy to ruin. Rumors became louder inside the palace. From the quantity of medals affixed to his uniform to the women he was spotted with in dining establishments and clubs, staff members observed his fixation with status symbols. Despite his inability to gain respect, he was yearning to be admired. His friends started calling him naive. Readily influenced by flattery and open to forming relationships with anyone who made him feel important. Later on, this weakness would prove to be the decisive factor in his demise. Andrew was looking for purpose when his Navy officer career ended in the late 1990s. His appointment as a commercial ambassador was intended to increase British trade overseas. Rather, his role turned into yet another scandal. There were rumors that he had connections to corrupt businessmen and tyrants. According to leaked U.S. diplomatic cables, he was conceited, impolite, and contemptuous, which embarrassed British officials who collaborated with him. By using his royal status to get access and favors, he had transformed the workplace into a venue for his personal networking. Once a symbol of military discipline, the prince now stands for corruption and greed. Despite the constant mockery from the media, Andrew maintained his arrogant demeanor. The protection of the monarchy was his only line of defense. The Queen protected him by paying off his debts and averting his scandals because she thought her son's honor was valuable. However, the personnel at Buckingham Palace had already come to the conclusion that the public was only beginning to suspect. In addition to being immature, Andrew posed a threat to the crown's continued existence. His behavior was irresponsible, his circle of friends became more toxic, and his selfishness was unrelenting. You will be shocked to learn that Ghislaine Maxwell introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein if you believe it to be absurd. All Andrew saw were the opulence, the private planes, the opulent residences, and the access to celebrities and models. The price of that friendship was something he did not see, or did not choose to see. Epstein was already well known in elite circles for actions that ought to have made any moral man flee. Andrew, however, did not run. He accepted it. Status and greed had blinded him. Those who had put up with his rage, conceit, and entitlement understood why. This was who he had always been. Later, the image of Andrew putting his arm around Virginia Giuffre's waist, a minor, with Maxwell grinning in the background, would horrify the public. The world found it alarming. It served as confirmation to the palace personnel. They were now exposing the guy they served in the most repulsive way possible. This man had yelled over curtains and stuffed animals, demanded compliance, and paraded through life without shame. It was only a teaser. You will now be aware of the specifics, unpleasant, repulsive details. I hope you're prepared. Even palace insiders started to doubt Andrew's future by the end of the 1990s, since his reputation had deteriorated so much. It should have been a new beginning after his 1996 divorce from Sarah Ferguson. Rather, it ushered in a new era of shame. Just a few months later, tabloids published pictures of Ferguson's financial advisor sucking her toes. Both of them were damaged by the controversy, but the public was perplexed by Andrew's insistence on keeping his distance from her. After their divorce, he intermittently lived with her for years, which fueled rumors that the two were financially involved in ways they never fully disclosed. Andrew, meantime, immersed himself in the way of life that brought him the title of Randy Andy. His interactions with socialites, models, and actresses were reported on an almost weekly basis, but his actions appeared to be becoming more desperate. He allegedly dated Caprice Burra at one point, but their relationship ended due to mockery. In the eyes of the public, the once handsome prince was aging terribly, being ridiculed as a middle-aged man who still clung to his boyish persona. Many believed that he would be given distinction when the Queen named him Britain's special representative for international trade and investment in 2001. It issued him a license instead. Theoretically, he was supposed to help British businesses expand overseas. In reality, he used the position to build his own empire. He surrounded himself with contentious businessmen, slept in opulent hotels, and traveled on private planes. There were rumors that he was making friends with Saif, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, and other autocrats, which made people wonder why a senior royal was hanging out with tyrants. American diplomatic cables that were leaked in 2010 supported statements made by authorities for years. In their discussion of anti-corruption measures, U.S. diplomats characterized Andrew as arrogant and impolite, bordering on impolite. He shocked American and British diplomats during a meal in Kyrgyzstan by lecturing them on how governments should disregard public opinion and raving about media. Andrew's conceit embarrassed them rather than demonstrating British ideals. But it wasn't arrogance that was his worst fault. He couldn't help but be flattering. Businessmen soon discovered that they could gain access to a British prince with a few compliments. Andrew became friends with Kazakh oligarchs and sold his house, Sunning Hill Park, to one of them for 15 million euros, 3 million euros more than it was originally listed for. The home was deserted and decaying later, reinforcing suspicions that the sale was not a legal transaction but rather a shady favor. He was continually being asked about money. Who was paying for his extravagant lifestyle, and where did he earn his wealth? Ghislaine Maxwell intervened in this situation and introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein seemed ideal to Andrew because he was well-off, well-connected, and could give him the glitzy lifestyle he so desperately desired. Epstein provided Andrew with relevancy, which he had been without for years. Suddenly, the prince who was slipping into disdain was able to enter the exclusive circles of New York, which included millionaires, celebrities, and models. Maybe he didn't care, but he didn't inquire about Epstein's past. Even though Britain no longer viewed him like king, Epstein's treatment of him was what mattered. Andrew started going to Epstein's properties on a regular basis. He later flew on Epstein's private jet, according to flight logs. He was seen by witnesses at Epstein's New York residence. Even after Epstein had done time in prison for sex offenses, he was photographed strolling beside Epstein in Central Park. The fact that a senior royal would hang out with a convicted sexual offender shocked the entire globe. For Andrew, everything went according to plan. He thought his name could survive any crisis, so he brushed Epstein's actions aside as intrusive rumors. Then the picture appeared. Virginia Jufor, then 17 years old, said in 2001 that Epstein and Maxwell had trafficked her and coerced her into having sex with influential individuals. She mentioned Prince Andrew as one of those men. Maxwell was smiling in the backdrop of the picture, which showed him smiling in a townhouse in London with his arm wrapped around her bare waist. For Andrew, it was a brief, unmemorable incident. The verdict was damaging to the globe. Everything was refuted by Andrew. Despite the photo proving otherwise, he maintained that he had no recollection of meeting her. He asserted that he had never visited Maxwell's townhouses upstairs. His justification seemed flimsy, and every denial strengthened the idea that he was lying, even if he said he had no motive to associate with Jeffer. Despite the palace's best efforts, the tale continued to worsen. More information about Andrew and Epstein's acquaintance was discovered by journalists, including the fact that Andrew remained at Epstein's residence in New York following Epstein's imprisonment. The idea that a monarch would enter the house of a man convicted of child trafficking was inconceivable to the majority of people. It was just a convenient location to stay, as far as Andrew was concerned. Andrew's name kept appearing in court documents and press stories as more women came forward to accuse Epstein. It was too late for the palace to try to keep him out of the scandal. Once derided as a pampered, unimportant playboy, the man was now associated with one of the most sinister criminal organizations of the contemporary era. His actions, which had previously been written off as conceit or eccentricity, were now viewed as dangerous. It no longer sounded juvenile to hear tales of teddy bear demands, yelling over drapes, and bullying maids. They sounded like the characteristics of a man who had never learnt boundaries, never been told no, and never faced consequences. Britain has put up with Andrew's excesses, spending, womanizing, and haughtiness for years. However, Epstein made him into a burden that the monarchy was unable to overlook. The walls of the palace could not conceal the fact that he had gone too far. And now his real demise had begun. After 2019, Prince Andrew's life was no longer typical of a senior royal. Suddenly, the so-called honorable prince, who had formerly marched by the Queen and moved freely in his military uniform, was a man without a purpose. His calendar was cleared, military affiliations were revoked, and royal patronages were eliminated. However, the harm went much beyond simply missing appearances. The monarchy itself was silently erasing Andrew, as the number of his controversies kept increasing. However, the patterns of power that shielded him for so long were what made his scandals more sinister than the private selfie he took with a child. According to American investigators, Epstein's network comprised aristocracy, CEOs, lawyers, and politicians. Although many were questioned, Andrew was shielded for decades by his status as the Queen's son. The fact that he was connected to Epstein was not the only discovery. The monarchy in Britain had protected him from responsibility. According to 2020 reports, news networks were under pressure from the palace to suppress stories for years. On a hot mic, an ABC anchor confessed that she had the story 3 years prior, but she was stopped because it included influential people. Ordinary men who were accused of the same thing would never have been able to enjoy the silence that Andrew did. Additionally, there was the terrible interview that ultimately destroyed all he had ever valued. He turned himself into a clown in the public spectacle known as the Awful Interview in 2019. Andrew was dragged into an unprecedented admissions battle due to Virginia Giuffre's accusations. Andrew said he had been somewhere else, at a Woking pizza place. The night a girl claims she was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein to have sex with him. To elicit sympathy, he brought up dads and daughters, but his admission that he didn't perspire during the dance due to an odd medical condition was the tidbit that went viral. He said that his perspiration glands were somehow cut off by too much adrenaline during the Falklands War. His incapacity to perspire had turned into a strange, self-satirizing defense mechanism. He gained notoriety for his most famous public admission, which was a refusal rather than a confession of guilt. I don't perspire. He wasn't silent as the accusations were rolling in. That same boy who believed the world was his playground, who infuriated the guards by kicking horses, and who considered staff suffering to be a joke. For the first time, he understood what repercussions really meant. Soon after, the royal palace threw him out after making him make the announcement. On November 20, 2019, Prince Andrew declared that he would be stepping away from public service for the foreseeable future. After his terrible interview with Emily Maitlis on BC Newsnight 4 days prior. He tried to justify his acquaintance with Jeffrey Epstein in the interview, which was broadcast on November 16, 2019. But it was widely criticized instead. Public indignation was sparked by his denial that he had ever met Virginia Giuffre, his assertion that he was incapable of perspiring, and his conviction that remaining at Epstein's residence was the right thing to do. Companies, colleges, and nonprofit organizations immediately started severing their connections with him. Because of the intense criticism, Andrew released a statement claiming that his affiliation with Epstein had seriously disrupted the royal family's operations. This was the first time a senior royal has been driven into semi-retirement due to a public scandal, and the Queen authorized his departure from duty. That's not all, though. Andrew stayed out of the U.S. even after Epstein passed away in 2019 and Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested in 2020. Attempts to take him to court were resisted by his solicitors. Until Virginia Giuffre finally filed a lawsuit against him in a New York court in 2021, he evaded being served papers on multiple occasions. For Andrew, that case was disastrous. A portion of his settlement, which was reportedly worth up to £12 million, had to be paid by the Queen in order to prevent a public trial rather than as an admission of guilt. Nevertheless, everyone knew what had recently transpired. A check had been issued by a royal to stifle sex assault allegations. However, the dishonor was not buried by the settlement, even though it did bury the legal battle. It couldn't have come at a worse time. Britain's economy was failing. After Prince Harry and Meghan left, the monarchy was in shock, and then Prince Philip passed away in 2021. Although he was told to avoid the spotlight, Andrew walked behind the casket at his father's funeral. He was still captured on camera. His shamed appearance, strolling meekly next to his siblings, was in stark contrast to the proud naval officer he previously was. The Queen's favorite, a veteran of the Falklands. When Queen Elizabeth passed away in 2022, Andrew's attendance at royal events was closely controlled. He was only given a brief reprieve at the laying-in state and was not permitted to wear his military uniform for her burial procession. When he appeared, crowds jeered. "You're a sick old man," hecklers yelled, and a protester was arrested by Scotland police for upsetting him. A British prince could not even go out in public without encountering outright hostility for the first time in generations. However, another struggle was taking on behind the royal gates. The now King Charles subtly stated that Andrew would never again serve in the royal army. According to leaks from people close to the monarchy, Andrew pleaded for reinstatement, stating that he still had a part to play. However, the response was uncompromising. No role remained. According to reports, Andrew even thought about taking legal action to compel himself to return to his public duties. His desperation exposed what he dreaded most, that he was just a disgraced man without identity in the absence of the palace. And he was done with this fresh accusation by 2024. In March 2023, Home Secretary Sula Braverman barred a Chinese businessman, later identified as Yang Tengbo, from the UK on national security concerns. The businessman was first named in court documents as H6. The Special Immigration Appeals Commission's judges concluded that H6 had developed an anomalous level of confidence with Prince Andrew. According to documents, Andrew's advisor, Dominic Hampshire, gave H6 permission to represent him in negotiations with possible Chinese investors. Authorities think H6 is connected to the United Front Work Department, a branch of the Chinese Communist Party that is involved in influence activities, according to a letter from Hampshire to H6. Documents found on H6's devices showed connections to CCP officials and attempts to use his friendship with Prince Andrew for commercial or political gain. According to Prince Andrew's staff, when concerns were voiced, he stopped communicating with H6, visited with him only through formal channels, and never brought up delicate topics.